Welcome everyone to the November 18th City Council work session.
Like ambiguity in that.
All right.
Sorry.
I asked George before we start on the agenda tonight to give you a very quick, since you were very curious at the last meeting, give you a small update on the Metro Partnership.
There was a board meeting this evening, and there was a 10-0 vote to motion to hire John Lively as the temporary economic development specialist for the next 6 months, while the organization takes a big look at the structure of the Metro Partnership. They hired a firm out of Yakima, Washington. They're going to be looking at the organizational structure of the Metro Partnership, competitive analysis, and marketing and recruiting strategies to determine what the Metro Partnership is going to look like in the future, if there is even a Metro Partnership. So they're just getting started on the process. So John Lively will be the contact point. He'll be working out of the chamber building upstairs, and Christina Lay will still be helping out also. It'll be a 6-month contract with the ability to extend on 30-day increments if necessary, and also the can terminate for any reason with a 30 days notice. And he will be answering directly to kind of an executive committee of the Metro Partnership during that interim period. Hopefully at the end of 6 months, hopefully it won't take that long, but we've given ourselves 6 months. We'll have an idea which direction the Metro Partnership is going to be going. And it's not about Metro Partnership. What it is about is regional economic development. Which direction is that going to head? As I stated in a meeting we had last couple of weeks ago, right now, John Tamulonis from Springfield and Mike Sullivan from the City of Eugene and Glenda from the county are doing a great job working hand in hand, working together to make sure everything, any leads come in are passed off to the right people. So John Lively is going to be kind of, like I said, the focal point now for any leads that come in from the state or wherever, and he'll make sure that everybody gets engaged that needs to be engaged. So we're kind of entering a new era of economic development, and it's just a matter of which direction we're going to head.
And I will just close that out by thanking John and the staff for the great Economic Development Summit 2 days last weekend. I thought it was very informative and interesting and well done, and very much appreciate everyone's work on that. Gives us a place for us to begin our conversation too. Yep. So thank you. All right, back to work here. We're going to be talking about MUPTI again. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'll turn it over to Denny. As you might recall, we've had this conversation as an ongoing conversation for the last many months, and it's an important one, and so this is just a continuation of that discussion.
Thank you very much. The mayor always likes me to start with telling everyone what is MUPTI. So MUPTI is the multi-unit property tax exemption, which is a property tax exemption to encourage higher density multi-unit housing, particularly redevelopment within core areas and along transit corridors. As the city manager indicated, this is a continuation of prior discussions on MUPTI program reforms. We've had several discussions before, so I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. Just a reminder, the MUPTI program has been suspended by council through July 31st, 2014, with the idea of giving City Council some time to consider some reforms for the program. So to date, we've looked at our existing program. We've looked at Portland's program. Council has put several ideas on the table. We've drafted some criteria with the idea of aligning MUPTI with Envision Eugene and focusing the program on clear public benefits. We talked a little bit about various boundary options for MUPTI, and the community continues to be engaged in our MUPTI discussions. But in order to make additional progress and finalize the program reforms, we're seeking more specific council direction related to 3 program reform elements, and those are, first, the criteria that we want to use, to review project applications and generate the best public outcomes in the program. Secondly, well, I'll just say that we've drafted some criteria. It's in your packet. And what we really are interested in is some direction from council, whether or not we're headed in the right direction. And if so, we would spend some more time kind of digging in and refining and defining some of the criteria that we have drafted. Secondly, we're seeking direction on potential boundary areas, keeping in mind that boundary considerations may impact the criteria that we ultimately use. In other words, criteria that we want to use in one area may be a little bit different than criteria we use in other areas. And finally, we're seeking direction related to the types and the extent of public involvement and how that overlays with what we've heard from council, which is related to timely implementation of the revised program. The most recent draft criteria, again, is included as Attachment A. Basically, you've seen this criteria on a couple occasions before. It's not exactly like the Portland program, but we feel that we've taken many of the concepts that council's talked about and that we've looked at, for example, in the Portland program, and we've really customized it to fit Eugene. I won't review it all again, but I want to highlight a couple of the proposed revisions that are being proposed. But first, just to remind you that the criteria is organized into minimum threshold criteria, which that's criteria that has to be met to be eligible. And then we have some additional public benefit criteria, and those can be used to improve a project and earn additional years of exemption in cases where the minimum threshold is met, but the need for a full 10-year exemption is not demonstrated in a project. And then there's some other considerations, some other program features, such as the proposed MUPTI review panel and the issue of establishing a cap on the program volume that are also included for consideration. The three primary revisions that we've proposed since our last discussion, first, we're proposing that the form of multi-unit housing specifically built as student housing be excluded from eligibility. Second, we'd like to consider adding some design guidelines from projects, and more importantly, provide some assurances that project designs that are reviewed during the application approval process are actually built in accordance with that proposed design. And finally, we've heard a strong need to incorporate some meaningful affordable housing provisions in the program. And we've provided that projects either provide that 20% of the units are affordable, or that the project is required to pay an annual per unit fee that's calculated on 20% of the project units, and that latter provision there is kind of a new concept. Again, there's several of the proposed criteria may need to be refined, defined. Again, generally what we're looking for is direction of whether you're generally supportive of the criteria as we move forward. Regarding the boundary, our boundary recommendation starts with these areas. Downtown plan boundary, which is basically the existing boundary for MUPTI, south of Willamette together with Midtown, and the area that we said we would bring back when it was removed, which is the Train Song 6th, 7th corridor area. If these areas are supported, the next step would be to look at them more closely, be more surgical in what the exact boundaries are, and come back with a more definitive boundary recommendation on these boundaries or other boundaries that council wishes to consider. As you recall, the Technical Resource Group, the TRG, provided an independent expert review of the Envision Eugene target for multifamily housing, and they recently reconvened to conduct some additional analysis. You should have received an emailed update memo from TRG's. I won't get into all the details because most of that is provided in the memo, but I would like to highlight a few of their findings. First, the targeted number on multifamily housing that will need to be built within the urban growth boundary through redevelopment is still assumed to be approximately 1,600 units, and I want to stress that that is redevelopment. That's not greenfield development or student housing development. It's actually redevelopment. Secondly, they looked at the past dozen years of multifamily construction, and they concluded that virtually no multifamily redevelopment could be identified in Eugene, with the exception of student housing and projects that included public investment interventions such as MUPTI. And ultimately, they reaffirmed that some combination of investment tools designed to remove these redevelopment barriers will need to be achieved in order to us to reach our redevelopment target. The TRG also explored the question of what it would take to accommodate our housing need without making investments. What they found is that existing neighborhoods would need to see significant density increases through upzoning or raising minimum densities on buildable lands. And while those might be possible in theory, they concluded that this is not consistent with past council discussions and not consistent with the community's values as they've been expressed in Envision Eugene. So we have proposed a process. We've outlined the steps for taking MUPTI basically through the reform process. Again, the first step in the process is to get council direction on the criteria, the program boundary, and the public involvement considerations for taking MUPTI forward. From there, we take the draft program reforms out to the community for stakeholder input, community input, and then bring them back for further revisions before they're adopted, before public hearing and before they're adopted in a new program ordinance.
Thank you. Let's see, I've got George Foley, George Brown, and Mike Clark.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I think we all agree that the way that MUPTI is currently structured is not working anymore, and that's why we're here at this table. But with the Envision Eugene process, I think that maintaining some form of MUPTI is very important, especially if we're going to if we're requiring the type of redevelopment and development that we hope to obtain through the Envision Eugene goals. One of the things that I have to say about the boundaries is I thought in previous discussions we talked about including the West 11th traffic corridor as one of the areas that we would maintain or try to maintain a MUPTI zone in.
What is being proposed really is a first phase of boundary, and our intent would be to come back with some additional considerations after, for example, a more detailed study of West 11th is done. Train Song area used to be in the MUPTI boundary, if you recall, and when council took it out, we kind of committed to bringing it back for discussion. South Willamette has undergone pretty significant planning recently, so we think it's ripe for MUPTI inclusion, and of course downtown has always been a primary focus.
Well, I think everything that we've heard in the discussions about the West 11th corridor, I think it's kind of essential that we do include that in the discussion. And the reason why the council removed the MUPTI from the Train Song neighborhood is because it was never used. Is that correct? Applied for,
Actually, as I recall, the action that council took was let's just focus on downtown now. It wasn't necessarily any reflection of what was or wasn't happening in Train Song, so they took out West University and Train Song and really only limited it to what I think generally was agreed upon, and that is we want to support downtown.
and then the other thing, as far as the criteria, the affordable housing part, I think it's very essential that we have that. Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as the land banking for affordable housing, we no longer have property banked away for such developments. So I think we should really figure out how we can strongly encourage any redevelopment to include actual housing. But if that's not going to pan out, then some sort of a fee is necessary. If enough is collected, they can go ahead and redevelop their own site somewhere. But I think that's very important that we do address the affordable housing issues in the new revised MUPTI program.
So before I go to George Brown, I want to do a little follow-up on this, and that may help us with the rest of the discussion. I think what you need is as much clear direction from us as you can get. And so if the West 11th idea is something that people support, you would want to know that. And from my perspective, that would, even though we may not be able to act on it for a while, it would show some intentionality, which I think could be very important as we look out into the future. So at some point, you may consider a motion or something so we get it, make a decision about whether to move forward with that at this time or not, so we can give them as much clarity as possible. And I'll put you in the queue, and I'll put you in the queue. Greg and Betty, and now it's George Brown.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to be in every round, too, please. Well, first of all, I want to thank staff.
Just a minute, I want to say this, because I was doing it myself. I was doing this. We have a request to ask everyone to speak more closely into their microphones, and I am the number one guilty person, so don't do as I did. Okay.
Except for Chris. He can sit in the first row.
I'm not so sure even that works. Go ahead, George.
Thanks, Mayor. Well, first of all, I want to thank staff for bringing this forward. I think it's a good start, but it's just a start. We really need to drill down on every component of this and be much more specific. And I think personally that the closer we adhere to the Portland Housing Bureau model, the better product we're going to end up with. And for instance, and I don't mean this as a criticism because I know we're just kind of starting this, but I think, one of the first things is, and these are things that we can discuss in future, do we want the process to be competitive? Do we want there to be a submittal date like they do in Portland? The period opens on August 15th, and 45 days later, the developers have 45 days to submit their proposal, and then they are looked at competitively by a review board, and then the selection is done by or before July 1st. That provides clarity for the developers. They know what the timeline is. They know that it's competitive. There's also a ceiling on the amount of the foregone revenue that's granted every year. Portland gives $1 million for everybody. That's it, $1 million for all the projects total. Last year, they had 8 successful projects to share that $1 million tax exemption. I think we need to discuss that. I'd like to see us institute that. Then the ceiling refreshes every year. Then the next year it's another $1 million for new proposals. So I think we should do something like that. We need to discuss, does the commercial part of the development qualify for the tax exemption? I'm willing to do that. I think that's a good stimulus, but only if it's a service that's being provided, say like a grocery store or something like that, that is not being provided in that neighborhood, like say within a half-mile radius. If there's no grocery store, you want to build some housing and a grocery store underneath, that's great. You're not competing with anyone else? Fine. You get the 10-year exemption on the value of that improvement, too. I would support that. Because there's areas of town we know are food deserts, for instance. So I think that's a reasonable thing. And then we need a discussion about point scoring system. If it's a competitive process, let's just say there's 5 proposals and our cap is $1 million. And then we need to know how we're going to score those competing proposals, and we need a pretty well, every round, please.
So before I go to Mike, I think in attachment A, we talk about all of those issues that George mentioned, right? The competitiveness and the ceiling and the scoring system, but not in the detail that he's...
Well, a couple comments. First, we considered the competitive process, which Portland has. But if you look back at the history of the program, there's been about 11 non-student housing projects in 30 years. So that means we get one application every 3 years. I don't know that having some, a single application or very few applications wait for the next time period is necessarily in our best interest if there's not going to be a lot of competition for the program. So I think we we could respond to a high volume and reconsider that, but at this point, we didn't feel like there's enough competition to warrant a process such as that. And Portland has a much more expansive boundary. It's like 12% of their city, so they have a lot more demand.
Okay, thank you for that. So I guess, again, we've got to look at specific questions to ask the council as a whole about how they want to move forward on this, and you may think about that, George. Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm fine with West 11th. Looking at this, when it was first raised, there was one issue for me that was paramount for changes, for additions, for corrections to this ordinance. But with this overall, I think we have a bigger issue to deal with before we dive into the specifics, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I first want to say that first most important piece for me was local hiring. If we're going to have the trade-off of value, that we're going to give consideration to folks who will build things where we've planned and want them to build them, to make it affordable for them to do so and profitable for them to do so. There's a public give here in foregoing the taxes. There has to be a commensurate public benefit from the project. For me, the chief most important benefit, aside from the fulfillment of the goals we've set and the plans we've set, is that we hire local people to do the work. If we're going to give up local tax dollars, it should go to local people doing the work. Now, I sat down for a pretty lengthy meeting with a group of local trades folks and union folks back several months ago. And I was really kind of interested to hear how they thought it was important to some of the issues that they thought could be incorporated into this that would ensure local hiring. It was more about payroll being open so that they could see things and they could know where people's, were being paid who were employees. It was around training, and it was around, having the right kind of skills that you could verify. And it was about lead certification as well, because that kind of guarantees the high quality of the work that's being done. And I think these are good goals, and I'd like us to get more detailed in the local hiring and include that portion. I'd like to hear from more of those folks so we get that part right. But to the bigger issue of the public trade-off, this is supposed to deliver a public good. And I think the biggest challenge we have is that most folks in the community don't see the public good and the public benefit from this. That's a political problem, not a detail problem. I think the first thing we have to solve is greater community involvement in the tenets of what we put forward so that we have something that reflects community will when we pass it, and if we pass it. So that we have something that the rest of the community can stand behind. And I'll need a second round to go into detail about what I mean, but that public process and a group to work on this in detail, I think, is the most important first thing we do to make sure that we build something that can have public support. In a second round, please, Mayor.
Next up is Greg.
Thanks, Mayor. I want to echo the sentiments of Councilor Poling on this with regard to West 11th. I don't know whether people notice this or not, but we have some significant transportation infrastructure investments going on West 11th and 6th and 7th right now with MX. And one of the ways that we can realize some of the benefits of the work that was done in the West Eugene Collaborative several years ago is by looking to extend these zones in places where we have those infrastructure investments. And I think that that's critical. Both, eventually we're going to go out Highway 99 and River Road with that transportation infrastructure as far as public transit is concerned. But I think that it's important to include West 11th in that area because, again, the line for the West Eugene MX is going to go 6th, 7th, and then up and out West 11th, and I think that there is a significant need for housing development in several sections of West 11th all the way out, going out west. The other thing that is kind of struck me is I want to be careful about our housing dispersal policy, particularly when it comes to affordable housing, and that this does not trigger a clumping or clustering of quote-unquote affordable units in, certain areas that are less able to, handle that kind of development, and that we look at making sure that our affordable housing developments, if we are using MUPD as part of that strategy, is well dispersed throughout the community geographically, and that we also look at, and this may sound a little bit contradictory to what I just said, but providing specific incentives for addressing blighted areas. And most notably, again, as we go up and down 6th and 7th, there's a lot of empty buildings, a lot of empty lots now where buildings used to be. There's a lot of potential for development as far as, multi-unit housing, and that can also be a spark and a spur for commercial development as well. So I want us to keep those things in mind as we reshape this policy.
Betty?
Thank you. I continue to think that everyone should pay taxes, and I think we should abolish this program. I was willing to use it for the center of downtown temporarily, and I think downtown is going to be okay now. As for helping out on the transportation corridors, I thought the theory was that you have the transportation corridor that will attract development, and I think that happens sometimes. I'm really opposed to our saying, there's a thing in here, if they're going to make more than 10% profit. I don't think we should guarantee anybody a profit, that being in business, you're taking chances. And we shouldn't take the chance for them with the public's money. As far as, and I know that the council is going to approve some form of MUFTI, and I will vote for the things that I think should be changed, but in the end, I will vote against using it. But when you say you'll do it for things that would not be built otherwise, well, every developer is going to tell you that, and we have in the past always believed them. They say, we can't build this if you don't help us. And the fee, instead of housing, they're going to pay the fee because they don't want the mixed housing that some people want. And I think we should, if we do it, we should insist on a percentage of the housing to be less expensive. Not subsidized, but affordable. We use that word affordable sometimes to mean subsidized, but between what I think 80 and 100% of the median income is a good thing. And that should be a requirement, not optional. I wonder what's wrong with South Willamette as it is. Why would we need to? It's very full of businesses right now.
If you look at our Envision Eugene strategy, it's based on generating more density along corridors, and it's one of the corridors that we feel like it has a lot of potential for redevelopment. And again, what we're talking about is redevelopment, getting more density along those corridors so that it doesn't spill out and affect the neighborhood. So, the whole Envision Eugene strategy is really based on that corridor density, and it's a corridor, and that's why it's targeted.
A person who has a business there now doesn't think he or she needs to tear it down and build something bigger, I think.
And we're not suggesting that as part of the program that they do that. It's really, it may create an opportunity for a property owner who is willing to sell, because there might be some higher value that could be achieved if it were a more dense mixed-use development, for example. So our hope is to get the density. Our hope is not to push out commercial enterprises. That's really going to be a property owner decision of whether they redevelop or not.
I'll just add a couple comments. remember, part of the assumption is that there's approximately 600 units that won't happen at all. Redevelopment, meaning not on green fields, that just won't happen without some sort of incentive. So that's the assumption that the TRG has fact-finded and verified. And so the question is one way to get those 1,600 is to provide a MUPTI incentive, and one of the places in which that is most ready to happen is in the South Willamette corridor. And so without the incentive, we're not going to get the redevelopment of multi-unit housing even in that corridor based on the information from the TRG. And so even in a place that's ripe for development, the assumption is that there is going to need to be some sort of incentive like MUPTI even to make it happen there.
Well, if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. In my opinion, if they don't have another place people who want to build something will find a place to build it. And it's up to us to do the zoning, but not telling people what they have to build.
Right. I think one of the dilemmas is that by state law, we have to prove that we have the capacity to meet our 20-year projection for population growth. And if there's 1,600 units of multi-dwelling units that can't be met without some sort of incentive, the alternatives either are increased density, rezone in neighborhoods to increase density, or you bump out the urban growth boundary to account for it.
But we don't know whether it might happen voluntarily without an incentive. That's my...
Chris?
Thank you. I appreciate the nuanced work that we're doing to try to get to a MUPTI that is both responsive to the changing environment, but still provides for a tool that, albeit we don't use it a lot, but we still have that tool available to us if we should need it in certain circumstances. And actually, I was going to ask the question that the mayor did around how often does MUPTI get used. Is it really a tool that we use out of our tool belt that often? And my recollection kind of jibes with what you're saying. It's not a tool we're using a lot. So I don't think we're going to have people lining up to use it. I don't predict the future, but based on the past, it's not a tool that gets used a lot. So it's not one of our primary tools. But when we do need to be thoughtful in a certain specific area for a certain specific goal, it's a nice tool to have, which would lead me to support what both Councilor Evans and Councilor Poling are saying. I think we have already considered that the West 11th corridor is where future growth will occur. In fact, I participated in the West Eugene Collaborative. One of the areas we specifically looked at, in addition to West 11th, was West 7th and West 5th. That industrial area won't be industrial forever, and it will eventually redevelop. And it won't redevelop just as more industry, it will redevelop into something else. And I think whether it's MUPTI or other tools, we can use in partnership to help redevelop that in a way that really pursues our Envision Eugene goals and makes that something that is really worthwhile and not just whatever accidentally happens there. I think just taking a hands-off, whatever grows, grows, can lead to a lot of the things you don't want to have happen in a community happen. Properties not being utilized as well as they could. Revenues for the city are not as good as they could be. Development doesn't occur in a way that provides for sufficient density as well as neighborhood character. I think there's many areas where you do have to be engaged in order to be able to get the outcome that you want. And so I think having those tools is really in the best interest of the community to help us develop in a way that maintains the quality of life that we want to have. We all talk about quality of life. You don't get good quality of life by just taking your hands off the wheel and letting the car go wherever it's going to go. You steer to the quality of life you want to have, and I think having these tools helps us do that.
Claire?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. I also appreciate the work put into this. And I think we probably all support the idea, or maybe we've already decided to remove the student housing projects as eligible for a MUPTI. Do you feel that the definition that's been drafted here covers that sufficiently? I just want to double check.
Yeah, I mean, what we tried to focus on is the form, not the student. There's some forms of housing that are, I would consider to be desirable, that are open and available to the general public, to families and so forth, that might be highly occupied by students, but are in a form that they're just traditional, more like traditional apartments. So we've tried to focus on the form, not the student. And I think ultimately council will have the opportunity to look at those and really determine whether they look and feel like student housing or not. But we want at least to put people on notice that this is not the intent of the program. So if it's a student housing project, it's not going to get approved.
Great, thank you. Can you remind us, I do actually like the proposal of, for the affordable housing piece, that either there's accommodation within the building itself or payment of this fee. Partly I like that because then it does give us some control over where we might support affordable housing and have a more direct impact on that. So can you remind us where that fee would go and how the council might utilize it?
What we've heard from council is they would like that to be dedicated, a dedicated fee that would be dedicated to affordable housing issues and potentially, I think you've mentioned homelessness issues. That would really be up to council to decide, the policy of how to use those fees. So it
would be set aside in a separate fund, and we would have
It could
know
be.
how much that was. And
that'd be a council decision, but it could be, yes.
okay.
Yeah, it would be accounted for separately, and then the council would appropriate that at any particular time for a particular project or for a particular use. It could not be spent unless the council appropriated it.
Great. And referring back to what Councilor Clark said about the local hiring piece, I would also like to see more detail there. I know there was some challenges around that aspect, so I think we might need to dig a little deeper into that. In terms of the boundaries, I think what is being proposed makes sense to me in terms of the goals around Envision Eugene and where our transit corridors lie, and I also would support the idea of extending it out West 11th. I do agree there is a tension between what would happen anyway with the MX going out there, but when we're talking about brownfield development, this is the kind of development that we would like to see, so we're not having brownfields just lie vacant. And so this is the kind of program that can help us make sure those things get redeveloped in a positive way. I don't think our market is competitive, is robust enough to support the competitive application process that Councilor Brown was alluding to. We've heard that it costs just as much to develop here as it does in Portland, and we don't necessarily get the same return on that investment. But I do wonder about the idea of a rolling cap on the cumulative or total amount the city would be giving out in tax breaks, which I believe is part of the Portland's program. And I would be interested in looking at how we would make that work. And then I am also interested in the scoring aspect, and I don't know if that's coming back in the next draft or how that's being incorporated. So what is happening around that idea?
If you remember, it wasn't attached in this agenda item, but we proposed a scorecard system where that additional public benefit criteria would be scored, and we have an example. I guess what we're interested in today is to find out, are we, again, headed in the right direction with the concept, and then we can kind of refine a scoring system on all that. We didn't spend too much time on a scoring system until we kind of know where we want to head with the various criteria, but when we can do that, that would be the next step.
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification. That's all I had right now. Thank you.
Alan?
Thanks for the work on this and the next pushing the ball down the field. I like the no student housing part. I like linking the overall amount of the MUPD to the rate of return you get. If it's too big, then you make the length of the MUPD shorter. I am not sure how the additional public criteria actually get incorporated here, and that's what you were just kind of looking at or asking about, Danny. I'd like to think about that some more and actually get some more detail about how that gets in there. All it says right now is the applicant can project elements to increase additional public benefit to increase the term of the exemption up to 10 years. But how does that actually work, and how do these things get weighted and things like that? I think that's something we need to work on. I like the green building LEED Silver requirement. But I think that the energy efficiency part is sorely lacking in here. Basically, LEED Silver is code. as far as my understanding is concerned. So that doesn't get you anywhere on energy, and I think the energy part of building is incredibly important as we move forward because it becomes the operating cost. It also is related directly to people's rents. And I like the neighborhood contact, but it's just a requirement they actually make a contact, not that anything happens with it. Not sure if we can make that stronger. I like the financial reporting requirement. I'm glad that still is in there. I think the areas we need to work on, one of my big concerns was the local hiring provision. I think these are okay, but they're blanks. I'd like to get more into the details of that. The affordable housing options, the way that, if I'm a developer, the way that I'm going to look at this, I'm going to cost out A and B, and I'm going to say which one's cheaper, and that's the one I'm going to do. So these two need to be approximately the same value to them. Right now, it seems like they're not equal. And so, and I don't know where the $1,000, that's just an example.
It's an example, yes.
So I was thinking actually that would come from a different perspective, that you would have it be, figure out what 20% units would cost and say it costs 5 or 10% more, then say it's 10%, then the fee would be 10%, and then you'd have it paid over years. So it's not a set fee, it's more based on how much they get, based on the MUPTI. And then I like the idea of a volume cap. I thought every year a budget for MUPTI is a good idea. And I think an open enrollment period kind of is more organized for staff and for the city and maybe for developers. And then the application fee stuff just kind of disappeared. Yes.
Another round. Okay. So in the second round, I have George Brown, Mike, George Polling, and Alan at this point.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I mean, it depends. Maybe we don't need to do a competitive process. I mean, maybe if we, once we come up with the product, we could leave that piece out, and then maybe say 5 years down the road, let's say maybe a lot of people were applying, then we could always, I would recommend that we look at that again if in fact there are several applicants in any given year, to make it competitive. I think we still should have some kind of a cap. I mean, Portland's is $1 million, and they have a huge they call theirs multi. They have a huge zone, and that works well. They had 8 successful applicants last year. So, and by the way, some of them, they were different sizes. Some were small, some were pretty large. I think we need more detailed developer annual reporting and review. Portland Housing Bureau is very specific. They want to see full project-based audited financial statements. They want to see internal revenue, service tax information, things like this. This is not unusual, by the way. This is the same information that the developer is showing to their bank, their lenders. So it's not like this is, of course it would be private. It would be confidential. There would not be newspaper reports of those things. But it's not intrusive, it's not unusual. This is the same info that their bank wants to know, so I think we ought to add that. And also, I think there should be some additional application requirements, like Portland Housing Bureau. For instance, they want a pro forma development budget, pro forma sources and uses, 15-year pro forma operating cash flow. They want all components of developer equity, including invested cash, and they want a copy of the market study provided to the senior lender for the project. Show their senior lender that's viable. I think that they should provide that to the city also. So I think we ought to refine both of those elements to incorporate into our plan. And let's see, what's next? I'm going to need another round. There's a couple other things I want to go over. Thank you.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. One of the details that has popped into my head, I want to be clear about this. I'm nowhere near as concerned about local firms as I am about local residents doing the work. Now, some of the folks I met with talked about having certified payroll as a way to verify that, and I heard some concerns around that. But any any employee-based, locally based folks would be able to talk about W-4s and the zip code that's listed on that. It's an easy way to verify what percentage of local folks are actually doing the work. And I don't have a percentage I would recommend there, but I would certainly recommend that it even be Lane County rather than Oregon, in the sense that they're local residents. The political issue, which we haven't talked about much, falls under the public process and timeline. I think that we face real struggle if we spend a lot of time on this and come back with something that staff and the TRG and council has, crafted and spent a lot of good time and effort at, and it still doesn't have public support. I think we're in jeopardy of losing the tool. So with the public process, I would really strongly like to urge us to consider a stakeholders group that works on this for whatever length of time is necessary. I was one of the original advocates that we need to do this quickly and get it going again, but we've decided to put it off long enough to do this right. And I think having a large group of interested stakeholders that everybody knows is both technically proficient to be able to talk about this intelligently and sufficiently well known to be able to advocate then that it is of significant community benefit to have this program is critical to us having a successful one long term. So even if this takes us a little bit longer to do, I'm not in a hurry. I don't want to see it come back to us as an ordinance where it hasn't had a thorough vetting from a group of local stakeholders. I couldn't support it at that point. Thanks.
George Poling?
Thank you. In reference to the local hiring, I'm all in favor of that, but when we had the panel of people up here several months back talking to us, one of them made an observation that sometimes we run out of qualified workers here in our local community. So we need to make sure that we put something in there that if we don't have the workers to fill the positions, we're going to have to go outside the area. So they get extra credit for hiring local, but I don't think they should be penalized if there aren't the local workforce available. And as we heard the last on Thursday and Friday, this area is lacking in manufacturing skills and construction skills. And that's one thing that we're looking at in the regional prosperity is trying to develop that. So depending on if and when all this happens, we may or may not have the qualified people here locally. And then the question I have is, after the first go-around, John, do you think I need a motion to include West 11th Corridor? Okay. Thank you.
No, sounds like at least head nod would say, yes, let's go and include that for the, go forward.
My recollection is like Claire's and Chris's. I thought that was one of the first conversations we had when we were talking about the Envision Eugene and also with the West Eugene EMX, is that this is one of the areas that we want to see redeveloped. So I was a little surprised that it wasn't included originally, but thank you.
It'll be in.
Adding it back in.
That George? Alan?
Yeah, one of my big things about this, and I haven't been very supportive of Upbeat, though, is that it needs to show real community benefit. And the way that you show community benefit is that you have certainty about what you're getting and clarity about what you're getting, and above and beyond what the business as usual is for that particular type of development. So things like local hiring can be a specific local benefit that we can quantify, and I agree with Mike. It's local residents, not firms necessarily. There is a specific thing in here, exemption for specialty work not available to local market, and be reviewed on a case-by-case basis if there's not available. But the other part of that is merely a good faith effort to solicit bids from women and minority business enterprises. I'm not sure. I think that's sufficient. The certified payroll idea has come up several times. I like that idea, but it needs some more work. I'd like to see an energy efficient requirement here of 20% beyond the code. And the application fees thing got diluted down to one sentence. I think that needs to be beefed up a bit. It was more complicated.
Would you like a
before.
response to that?
Yeah, sure.
Until we really know what the whole framework of the program is, how administratively labor-intensive this is or isn't, we need to balance that as how much is it going to cost us to have a panel and a review process, and so it's kind of blank at this point, but we intend to have a fee. We intend to have a fee that's greater than the current $400 or $500, but we just don't really know what it's going to cost yet to administer until we have the criteria in place.
Okay. That makes sense. I think that we need more details about the financial reporting and what would be in there. I think that's, of course, it would, and we need to say specifically that would be kept confidential and that we'll use it for gross programmatic conclusions, not specific project ones. The boundaries, the downtown is, I fought long and hard to get it out of West University neighborhood, and downtown's fine. The Midtown part actually includes Civic Stadium site, isn't it?
We haven't been that surgical about property by property. It could or it couldn't. It really, what we've kind of just shown is some
Right on Willamette.
we've shown some general areas.
Pretty hard not.
Yeah. it'd be almost
You could
impossible.
decide to put it in or out, I guess is what I'm saying. It
Takes up the
hasn't been
sidewalk
decided
along
yet.
that, Or Mupti includes right
Only
along
the sidewalk.
edge.
Sidewalk, so if you can grow houses on the sidewalk, that'd be great.
That's really micro housing.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about expanding it right now. I think to West 11th, I think having this be smaller at the beginning and changing it later is probably a better idea. It's easier to grow things than it is to have it be too big and too cumbersome for folks to swallow. So I'm not sure about West 11th adding that in here. And then finally on the mixed development, there aren't any mixed development projects in Eugene, and there are very, very few in Portland. I think there's less than a handful. So I'm not sure that works, but
Greg, you're up.
Thanks, Mayor.
And mixed income, not mixed
Oh, I'm
income.
sorry,
Got
John.
it.
Did you
not
say-
mixed development.
Just real quickly on something like the local hire, in some ways, we don't have to make it complicated. Certified payroll is actually a good way to do that, and that's just, somebody has to go out and do that. So it's, what we would need from the council is, what are the boundaries around that? Is it Lane County, is it Oregon, is it, strictly Eugene? And then we can figure out how to implement that, and what would we try to do in the most administratively easy way. And then around certainty, I think what would be important to know is it a go, no-go? Because the way somebody can come up with a plan, the reality is how that plan gets implemented in the actual certified payroll. And so if it's at some point in your project you're not actually meeting the goal, then does the MUPTI now go away, regardless of where you are in that project? And those are the kinds of things I think we would want the guidance on, not so much the details of how to implement the plan. We can figure that out pretty administratively easier.
Clawback kind of thing.
Yeah, so it's...
Greg?
Thanks, Mayor. Could we look at, instead of neighborhood contact, neighborhood support, and adding that to the scoring criteria? I think it's critically important that when we are looking at, doing these kinds of things and giving these incentives out, that neighborhood support is much more resonant than just, having the developer go out and contact folks and talk to them about it. If you have, significant neighborhood support or support of a neighborhood association, I think it makes it not just more palatable, it makes the project much more compatible with what the neighborhood is and where they want to go with the development of housing in their neighborhood. The other thing, too, is at some point in time, and I don't want to put too much work on staff, I know that there are other similar MUPTI programs outside of Oregon, and could you guys come back with maybe 2 or 3 examples of how they've worked in other states, and what similar kinds of programs have done in terms of helping to redevelop specific areas and cities similar size to Eugene, similar type of profile. And as far as women and minority-owned contractors, being involved in the process, you get what you want to get and put an effort forward. And I'll give you an example. Several years ago, TriMet made a specific effort to engage women and minority-owned businesses in their rail projects, and they were able to come up with 24% participation. And ODOT couldn't seem to get their act together. They couldn't find any women or minorities who could contract with them. And so it can be done if you want to do it. And I think that this area needs to be strengthened in a way that allows it so that people who are small businesses who don't normally get the opportunities to get into these bigger contracts have an opportunity to participate and play ball with everybody else.
So my question, Denny, around this. Oops, don't back up. My question around this is, when we're done, what do we want people to think? Do we want people to think that if they hit all these bases that we're asking them to hit, and they're the only project who's in the pool, that it's a go for them? Or do we want to say, or do we still want to leave ourselves the option to say, well, in spite of that, maybe I don't want that kind of building on the civic property on Willam? I mean, I'm just asking that question because I think the intentionality has to be fairly clear. The thing that we faced with our previous MUPTI is sometimes people would think, well, if I just do everything they ask, it's going to be a go, and then we'd always have the statement, well, you don't have to say yes if you don't want to. So I just think there's something about the clarity of what it is we're telling them meeting all the things that we set up actually means. And I just really, I think it's a very important thing to think about.
Legally, it could be a different answer. I would agree that the more assurance that there is, I think it's better.
Or conversely, if it's wide open and it's going to be help, but it's not going to be you're not guaranteed anything, then let's be clear about that.
Right, either
as
way.
Well. Yeah.
But, and also, from our perspective, just administratively, it's easy to administer, and it's not overly complicated. And so it meets all the intent of what the council wants it to meet without just being a huge project or burden that it, on both the applicant or the staff to try to tease through all of that and work through all of that. So I think all of those would be helpful.
I think what I'm pointing at is just like you wanted the public to understand what, as much as we can, clearly what we intend to do with the MUPTI and what we hope to use it for. And the same thing with people who want to use it to be able to get their projects done, clarity around what there really can be guaranteed and what they can't be guaranteed, so that people don't have either leap to conclusions that aren't accurate or have expectations that we are not intending to live up to. So I don't know how to frame that any differently than I think to get to as much clarity around that is important for everybody and has to do with the political issue from all points that Mike is referring to. My other question for you right now is, I heard you nod your head about the West 11th thing, but I don't know if that's good enough, since I heard one of us say that they didn't agree with that, and so maybe you have to have a motion. And then I've got you the list. I bet you have the list there, Denny, of some kind of ceiling, the local hiring, I know you don't have the detail in your hands tonight, but they'll be telling you whether they want to pursue that or not. So I've got about 9 issues here that I've heard, and I guess the way that would be easiest to go about this is to try to get, if that's what you want, I want you to tell me
Absolutely.
what you want, that you put out something that you think should be included or not included, and that we kind of go through those and see what we can give them. So think about yours, George, and everybody, and let's start with you.
Okay, I guess I move to include the West 11th corridor in the boundary discussion.
Second.
Moved and seconded. George Brown.
I'd like to discuss that. I don't know that we need to get into specific boundary discussions, rather than, because I've hopefully we'll have 2 or 3 more rounds left, and I wanted to talk about the boundaries. I think we may need most of one whole meeting to talk about the boundaries. So when we can do this, then I can make a motion while I move to remove South Willamette. And then I'll make a motion, I move to remove Midtown. I'll make a motion, I remove to remove downtown. So we can go ahead and vote on this, but I think we're headed down a sterile path this way if we get in too much detail right now. I think what staff is looking for is more of an overview. Like, I want to suggest additional areas out in Bethel, and I want to speak about West 11th, and I just,
So a proposal, George, that you might make, given what I'm hearing you say to George Polling, and he can tell you what he thinks about it, is you propose that we come back with a future discussion of boundary.
we absolutely have to. We can't nail this down tonight.
But I don't know that that's true, George. So I'm just telling you, I think that's what you need to give the instruction.
true.
You need to get that agreement from this council to do that, and you can ask George if he's open to that, or he will vote on this, and then we'll go to you. So it's up to him.
Well, I guess I would ask Councilor Polling do we want to spend the rest of this work session going over each street and each boundary zone? I didn't think that was the purpose of the meeting, and I'm just wondering if you could see your way to remove that so we could continue with the broader discussion.
I'm going to call on you, Mike, after
I don't think it's necessary to spend the rest of the meeting discussing each individual boundary. The boundaries that were identified in Exhibit A and West 11th corridor were the ones that we've originally talked about all along. So I think that just staying with Exhibit A plus West 11th is the direction that we need to at least start the conversation.
What I am hearing is that what you're really asking is if we have a future boundary discussion, that it include West 11th as part of that discussion, correct? I mean, if we're going to have a broader discussion, you want to have boundaries. If you want it to be different than the ones that are there, that may take more talk, and you're saying in that discussion, you want not just what's on that page, but you want West 11th to be part of that discussion.
And the only reason why I'm saying that is because, again, originally when we first started talking about all this, the discussion included the West 11th corridor, and how it dropped off, I don't know. So I was just trying to add it back to the original conversation. That's all I'm trying to do.
And I'm trying to not go down the rabbit hole either, so I'm trying to give enough for you to pursue, and part of that is this being added to what we would be discussing. That could probably happen anyway, but he wants to be sure.
So
Yes.
part of what, our next steps are to take what the council says that you have as a guideline, and what you're willing to consider into a MUPTI program, and have a little bit more of a conversation on the public. Now, we can, we'll kind of go through that and figure out how we think might be a best way to do that. But, so it's, for example, if nobody on the council wanted to have local hiring as part of the MUPTI program, it seems like we wouldn't spend a lot of time out there talking about that or getting input on that. And so it's helpful to know what are the things that the council would like to see generally in the program. I don't think you're committing to the final answer yet. And so what I did see most nods is say, at least a majority of the council said, West 11th makes sense to go out there and have a conversation. We can have more conversation about that. If it comes back and the council says yes or no to that, then that's where we would head for that. We're just looking to make sure we have sort of the realm to have the conversation.
I see hands going up all over the place, and I'm not ignoring you. I'm just trying to figure out in the time we have left how we give the next, go to the next step direction. And think about, we've got a motion on the table, so that motion's out there right now, unless you want to pull it back and reframe it.
No, I don't want to, Mayor, because, again, I'm going to say one more time, when we originally had this discussion, West 11th was part of that based on LTD and based on Envision Eugene. Why it got dropped off of Exhibit A or out of this discussion today, I don't know, and I'm just trying to add that back to the original discussion, along with the ones that are currently on Exhibit A.
I get that entirely. All right, so, and I'm trying to not spend 25 minutes discussing the details of this right now. So that's what I'm trying to do. Mike?
I would like to recommend that maybe what we do is parts of what we've discussed here is talk about it as subject heads, if not boundaries, whether it be West 11th, local hiring, caps, things like that, and essentially let the mayor bring up one of the subjects that was mentioned and see just a basic show of hands. How many people think that's an important aspect that should be included in the discussion and the details of this ordinance? The second phase would be to flesh out those with public input and to flesh out those in what I would suggest be a stakeholders group, and come back to a next work session of ours for us to do the final tweaking before it goes to ordinance language. Is that a way we can handle this?
From my perspective, the first part of what you said, I think is worth consideration. The second part, I think we probably need more consideration about what kind of stakeholder and what kind of process we want to have to move forward. I think that needs more discussion.
Personally, I would trust staff to do that, as we've done it enough times. I think they understand if we gave them general guidance of what the reason for having the stakeholder group is. I mean, to each of us individually. For me, it's...
I don't know.
I want to...
Maybe I'm misjudging. I just don't know if everybody shares your understanding of what that would be. That's why
I think it needs broader community support so that what we end up accepting as the support of the community. So anyway, that's what I suggest we do.
So let's try this. The motion is still on the table, so we have to vote on the motion. Let's you want to speak to that?
I really want to speak to the motion. I mean, I don't know what other people want to do, but I want to speak to the motion in support of the motion because, if we are not including West 11th in this process, we're just engaging in some form of planning schizophrenia. We have been doing this for years and talking about West Eugene Collaborative, West Eugene MX, development in this corridor, and for us not to include in that toolbox this tool, it would really send a message out to the community that we don't have continuity in our planning, and that what we're trying to do doesn't make sense. So I think that we should vote on this and move forward with it. I don't think it's going to be an earth-shattering experience for us to include West 11th in a map.
So I'm going to suggest that you vote on this, and then I will put out for a head nod or hand raise or whatever you want to do, that we'll have a broader boundary discussion at a future meeting.
What is George's motion?
His motion is to add West 11th for the consideration for the mix.
I thought it was...
No, all he's saying is the current thing you're looking at doesn't include it. He just wants it included in the conversation.
Wants to make sure it's in the conversation.
Back into the conversation.
Right. Okay, all those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4. 5-6, in opposition, 2, okay, it will be in the conversation. So now I'm looking at around the room, and I'm saying, do we all agree that we need further boundary conversation about what's in and what's out?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. Next, Denny, what's next on the list?
I want to,
Local hiring.
Local hiring, do you want to discuss local hiring? Please let me know. Yes, everybody does. Next.
The cap, the dollar cap versus unit cap, I don't think we've had an agreement on how we cap the annual volume and
Want to say
program.
we'll have a further conversation about the cap, or do you want to know what the cap, to kind of get to where the cap is?
I think what would be great is, do we want a cap? Right now, there's not a cap, so it's,
Right.
do we want a cap? If the answer is yes, we can eventually come back with options. So I think it's that threshold.
Okay, I'm looking around. Do we want a cap? That may take a motion, because it's not
There's
agreement.
5-3.
hands.
Almost 5-3.
5-3.
That's not a vote. We're not voting.
Right.
Well, aren't we just voting to see if we're going to have a conversation about it?
Yeah.
And if it gets 5 votes, then we would?
There was enough interest to talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's,
Yeah, I think that's the
I voted
threshold.
no and agreed.
George?
I think we've kind of got off track with this process here about going, well, let's see, do we want to talk about this? Let's have a show of hands. I mean, I think staff's been writing down everything we've been saying that we'd like
But what they
to
told us, George, is
come back.
that they
I still have some points I'd like to cover that are, I think, super important, and I'd like to get them done before 7 o'clock. And, I mean, this,
well, it's my
um,
intention to go through the list.
but
And then
we don't have a complete list because there's still some points that haven't been covered.
You can add to the list
Add to the list.
Okay,
after she
All
goes
right,
through
but
the-
I want 3 minutes
I want to.
before this thing's over.
Okay, that's 6 minutes. You got it. All right.
But it's important we give the staff direction.
That's what we're trying to do.
That's what we were doing.
On that last one, what I would take from it is, there's a majority of the people say yes, they
Yeah,
like
let's
the
talk
idea of
about
a
it.
cap, so let's include the cap in the.
What's the next one, Denny?
affordable housing approach.
Want to talk about what kind of affordable housing approach you
Well,
want to have?
we've proposed something, I guess. Is that a reasonable approach, or should we be doing something else, I guess?
Well, I think what I heard, and so this is going to lead you to another one of those same conversations, which is, yes, it seems, and I'll look for a nod, but I think what I'm going to hear is, yes, there's interest. They have not come to a conclusion about the numbers on it and how it's to be done. It will take more chewing.
Okay,
And
that's fine.
everybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
Fine.
But it's definitely something they're interested in. That doesn't take you very much further than what you already knew, but nonetheless.
We'll eventually get there.
We've heard a lot of comments, but the competitive application process.
Okay, this is one that there seemed to be so I'm looking around the room, who wants a competitive process? So I only see one.
Related to a cap. Yeah, well, if you have a cap and,
Yeah.
too many applications, then it needs to be competitive.
So I'm going to say this, and then you see if it's what you're nodding to, is that what you're agreeing is at the onset you don't think you need that, but if we get a lot of competition, then we may want to come back to that and look at it again. Did that make sense to everybody? That's what Denny said earlier?
That was our recommendation, yeah.
No, so I need head nods or hands up about that. What the suggestion is, as I understand it, is no competitive process at the beginning, because we don't think we have enough folks. But if it turns out we have multiple, more activity, then we'll look at it again.
Yes.
I want to see, I need to see.
What are we putting our hands up for?
You want to say it? Maybe I...
No competitive.
Include that.
Include competitive competition, yeah.
She said not.
No,
unless.
not to.
She said
Not
no.
now, but if it gets busy enough, we then talk about it.
We're getting too specific with all this stuff.
Well, I'm just asking, so if you agree that we don't have it, at least in this beginning phase, please put your hands up.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's one, two, that's a,
Okay, we'll eventually probably come back with specific
okay,
options
all
on that
right.
one.
There's some discussion about LEED and energy efficiency, and we have a LEED silver provision, and
We need to go beyond that, was what the
the question
recommendation.
is, do we go beyond that? Yes.
Go beyond the lead level for energy efficiency. Are you interested in that as part of the discussion?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
There's a couple, but I think we're in agreement, but the need to define a scoring system, and I think that's something we intended
Everybody shake your
to
head,
come back
Declan?
with.
Yes.
So I think there's general agreement on that.
And financial
And
transparency?
then the financial reporting, again, we haven't necessarily defined every financial statement and such, but we will, and that was our intent. We'll look at Portland's model. We'll look at what we, typically do in our loan programs and all of that. Remember, there's a review panel that actually would be another layer of review that we would add to that. So, unless there's some other direction we should be going, I think we're in agreement that the financial reporting is critical.
What I heard in that, Denny, was a very strong desire on the part of many people around the table for real specifics about that.
And we'll come back with that, yes.
Okay, everybody okay with that? Yeah. Anything else on?
I'm running out of things on my list, so I don't know if you have anything on your list.
Discussion of the
We're out of
Stakeholders.
All right, Betty?
Okay, I just want to say one thing. If you have a list of a criteria and someone fits all the criteria, I think there's a real, and we say they're guaranteed to get the exemption, there's a real danger in that of people with enough money buying up desirable properties, tearing them down, and building something in order to get a tax exemption. Where if they keep the property they have now, they would not get the tax exemption. So I think that's really important to consider. That's all I want to say.
Hey, George Brown and then Mike.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. A couple things, Denny brought up a couple things that I was afraid was going to get left out. I think we need to talk about, does the commercial portion of the project qualify for the exemption? And I think they should under very strict criteria. I think that we need to talk more about that. And then, we kind of all agreed that we need to talk about the affordable component, but I want to get more specific. That's what I use this round for. I look here and I go, minimum 20% must be affordable to households earning between 80% and 100%. That's got to go out. It's got to be 60% of MFI. That's what Portland says. Portland does allow 80%, but only in the Pearl District, only in high-value areas where people have more disposable income. They allow that. I think that we really need to focus on the affordability component, and if we don't do that, people will not support this. So in the discussion, we need to discuss that point, and the part about the payment of an annual affordable housing fee, I think is a bad idea. I think we need to see affordable units built, not a developer, paying $1,000 per unit, for affordable unit in lieu of actually building an affordable unit, because at that rate, I figured it out, it's going to take many, 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 many years of $1,000 per
That was just an example.
to switch. Yeah, well, I think it's a terrible idea, because we need to see affordable units actually built and occupied, because when I got on council 5 years ago, the percentage of people who were rent burdened was 40%. It's 56% now, 5 years later. We're falling behind, we're losing ground, and so, rather than this promise, oh, well, here, we'll give you $1,000, and then, many years later, you can do something about it. If we require that 20% of the units be built affordable, it happens now. It happens when that development is ready to occupy, and that will make a huge difference in that 56% rent burden statistic. And also, another thing that needs to be refined in this section is the percentage of types of units. It needs to be proportionate. In other words, if there's 10 studios, 2 of them have to be affordable. If there's 10 four-bedroom units, 2 of them have to be affordable, all within the same development. See, it's got to be prorated like that, otherwise they'll pick, well, let's see, we've got 10
George,
five-bedroom
next
units.
And I don't know if we'll have time for it, but I'll put you
We'll
down.
see, hopefully.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. May we have a show of hands on a stakeholder group to give us recommendations on each of these components? A stakeholder group of people chosen by staff to weigh in on each of these components and make a recommendation to us on their thoughts around what would, for example, there are folks in the building trades industries that I'd like to hear from with regard to local hiring and what does that mean to them. There are people involved in this who have concerns about MUPD that I'd like to at least hear what their concerns are so that we don't build something that has a community resistance of some kind. So I leave that to staff.
We will involve folks. My one concern about having a stakeholders group is, for example, with the local labor force, my guess is we will want to bring several people to the table that are involved in that conversation that may not be part of a general stakeholders group because they may not have that much interest in the affordable housing component of it. So what we've heard and our intent is to bring a variety of people to the table to help with any numbers of the issues, and so you will have the benefit of a number of people in the community as you go forward too, which it may not be one stakeholder group, it could be a variety of processes to get there.
The important thing to me is that we help those folks' voices be very public about their recommendation, because we need, in my opinion, to have other people with other interests talking about the value of this program in the community for us to have something we can pass that has wide community support.
So I guess the question for you right now, because Mike is asking for a head nod, so the question for you is, do you want to give a head nod to what he's proposing now, or do you want to have a broader discussion about what this should be? And so he's asking, nod your head if you're in agreement with his stakeholder proposal, or put your hand up so I can see.
One stakeholder group?
That's what he was saying.
Like the TRG?
I would be willing to find a way in between what John and I have just outlined here. But the important part for they don't all have to meet in one room at one time to discuss the whole thing. But it can be at separate times from separate experts. The important part is what gets presented to us comes with the names of those people involved and their backgrounds and the kind of information that helped inform those recommendations.
You know, what I would suggest, not to belabor the point, but you know, I do think that's one of the things that you ask us and pay us to try to figure out how to do. And we've heard, I think, that it's important to include a variety of people on a variety of topics, and that they also have a voice that is vocal if they choose to be vocal, and you know whose voice is heard as part of our recommendation and what they've had to say. And we're happy to do all of that. I would just caution us from trying to design the public process at the table in the next 4 minutes.
I agree.
I agree.
I'm fine with that.
Stakeholder process.
We can, we'll be able to figure that out. I think that'll be helpful.
Feedback.
So are you all in agreement with what John is suggesting?
I think we'll be able to provide a good process for you.
Okay, all right. And Alan, you're next.
The idea of more than just, what should be the community, the neighborhood role in this? I don't think they should get veto power. No, I mean, with their specific proposal, whether or not it's support and that gets added into the matrix or not is the question. Versus just merely contact, which is what it is here. So I'd like it to be bigger than that, more of a role than that.
And Claire.
So I just quickly wanted to respond to the affordable housing piece and point out, I mean, I think it'd be fine to change the criteria down to 60% in terms of dwelling units included in a construction project, but the way this is written, it's only during the period of the tax exemption that they have to offer those rates at an at an affordable rate. And once the tax exemption is gone, those rates, the units go back to market value, we lose that affordable housing. So that's part of the reason I'm interested in the fee, and I agree with what Councilor Zelinka recommended about it being equal in cost or value to what it would be to have the units in-house, because then we can create affordable housing units that don't go away at the end of the property tax exemption period.
Okay, any other comments? Anything else you guys need from down there? I'm sorry that we couldn't come to a resolution on everything, but,
But it's good conversation, so that's
Okay.
very helpful. So that's helpful.
all right,
Very helpful.
all right, thanks.
Yes.
Next.